Picture this. A man chained to wood, wrists rubbed raw to the bone, feels the oar handle slip in his blood-slicked grip. The smell hits first. Salt, tar, and something else. Something copper-sweet and wrong. Human waste pools beneath the rowing bench where he has sat for 11 months. His back is a map of scars, each one a memory of the whip when his rhythm faltered. He cannot see the sky. Slaves never see the sky. But he hears it. A sound like thunder, except thunder doesn't make the hull shudder. Thunder doesn't send splinters the size of daggers spinning through the air. The man beside him, a farmer from Crete who wept every night for his daughters, takes a wooden shard through the throat. Blood sprays across the oar. The farmer makes a sound like a dog choking, then nothing. The galley lurches. Men are screaming somewhere above, but down here in the rowing pit, there is only the chain, the oar, and the growing certainty that death has finally come. Through a crack in the hull, new, jagged, smoking at the edges, he sees something impossible. Ships. But not like any ships he knows. Massive. Bloated. Sitting low in the water like pregnant sows. They barely move, yet fire erupts from their sides in continuous sheets of flame. Cannons. Dozens of them. More cannons than he has seen in his entire miserable life, all pointing at the Ottoman galleys now swarming toward them. The Turks are charging, hundreds of sleek war galleys, pennants streaming, drums pounding the attack rhythm. The greatest fleet the Sultan has ever assembled, racing toward what their admiral swore were slow merchant vessels, cargo haulers, easy prey to brush aside before the real battle. The chained man watches the first galley reach the fat ship. It simply disappears. One moment, a vessel of 200 men. The next, a cloud of splinters, bodies, and pink mist where the bow used to be. The cannon fire doesn't stop. It rolls like waves, each broadside erasing another ship, another 100 souls, another Turkish mother's son. The chained man begins to laugh. He cannot help it. The sound tears from his chest. Hysteria, terror, something almost like joy. For 11 months he has prayed for death. Now death is here, enormous and indiscriminate, and he is laughing at the beautiful horror of it. His Ottoman masters thought those were cargo ships. It was their last mistake. The date is October 7th, 1571. The place is the Gulf of Patras, where the Adriatic bleeds into the Ionian Sea. Within 6 hours, 30,000 men will die in these waters. The Mediterranean will change colour. Galleys will burn until midnight, and a bastard prince no one trusted will become the most celebrated man in Christendom. But the chained man knows none of this. He knows only the chain, the oar, and the growing crack in the hull that is letting in the sea. The water reaches his ankles, then his knees. The ship is sinking, his ship, and he is still chained to the bench. Above him, Ottoman sailors are dying. Beside him, Christian slaves are drowning. Somewhere out there, admirals are making decisions that will reshape empires. History is being written in blood and fire and cannon smoke. And one man, one forgotten prisoner whose name will never appear in any chronicle, watches the water rise and wonders if anyone, anywhere, will remember that people like him existed at all. They won't. Historians still debate whether the Battle of Lepanto changed anything. Empires rose and fell, treaties were signed and broken. The Ottoman navy rebuilt within a year. The Holy League that won this victory collapsed within 2. But something happened here. Something that still echoes. How does the greatest naval battle of a century begin with a trick? How does a coalition of enemies who despise each other destroy an empire's fleet in an afternoon? And how does the man who makes it all possible end up dead at 31, abandoned by the very powers he saved? The answer lies not in the water turning red this morning. It lies in the screams that came from Cyprus 18 months before, when the Ottomans taught Christendom what fear really meant. The screams from Famagusta reached Venice before the letters did. Merchants returning from the Levant spoke in fragments, their eyes hollow, their hands shaking when they lifted wine cups. They described sounds that woke them at night, sounds that had no place in the civilized world. The Senate listened, the Doge listened, and slowly, the Republic of Venice understood that everything had changed. Cyprus had belonged to Venice for 80 years, a jewel of the eastern Mediterranean, sugar plantations, cotton fields, harbours fat with trade. The island sat like a dagger pointed at the Ottoman underbelly, and Sultan Selim II, called the Sot by Europeans who underestimated him, had decided the dagger needed removing. The invasion came in July 1570. 60,000 Ottoman troops landed near Limassol. They moved north with the patience of a disease, taking town after town, leaving nothing alive that resisted. Nicosia fell first. The capital's walls were old. Its garrison was small. But the Venetians defended it anyway, because that was what you did. For 45 days they held. Then the walls came down. What followed made hardened soldiers vomit. 20,000 civilians, slaughtered in the streets, not in battle, afterward. When the killing served no military purpose, Ottoman troops worked through the city for 3 days, and the accounts that reached Venice described horrors that seemed designed to break something in the human spirit. Churches burned with families locked inside. Women passed between soldiers until they stopped screaming. Children used for target practice by bored janissaries. The commander who took Nicosia sent a gift to Famagusta, the last Venetian stronghold on Cyprus. A sack. Inside were the heads of the Nicosia garrison's officers, preserved in salt. The message was clear: surrender or share their fate. Famagusta did not surrender. For 11 months, 7,000 defenders held against 100,000 besiegers. They ate horses, then dogs, then rats, then leather boiled until it could be chewed. They fought sorties with swords so notched they bent on impact. They repelled assaults with boiling oil long after the oil ran out, then used boiling water, boiling sewage, anything that burned. Historians still debate whether Famagusta's resistance was heroism or madness. Perhaps both. The garrison commander, Marcantonio Bragadin, became a legend among his men. He walked the walls during bombardments. He personally led counterattacks. When soldiers despaired, he reminded them that Venice would send relief. Venice did not send relief. The Republic was paralysed. Its fleet was strong, but not strong enough. Its treasury was strained. And most critically, Venice knew it could not fight the Ottomans alone. It needed allies. But Venice had spent the last century making enemies of every Christian power in the Mediterranean. Spain distrusted Venetian commercial ambitions. Genoa wanted Venice destroyed almost as much as the Turks did. The Pope commanded moral authority but few ships, and the Habsburg Empire was tangled in problems from the Netherlands to Hungary. While diplomats argued, Famagusta starved. In August 1571, the fortress finally surrendered. The terms were honourable: safe passage for survivors, respect for the wounded, acknowledgement of their valour. The Ottomans broke every promise. Bragadin was brought before Mustafa Pasha, the Ottoman commander. What happened next became a crucifixion story that spread across Europe like fire. First they cut off his ears, then his nose, then they made him carry baskets of earth back and forth along the walls, crawling on hands and knees, while soldiers whipped him and jeered. Then, and witnesses recorded this with the precision of trauma, they flayed him alive. The executioner started at the neck and worked down. Bragadin reportedly recited prayers until he lost consciousness. It took hours. When it was done, they stuffed his skin with straw, dressed it in his commander's uniform and paraded it through the streets. Then they sent the stuffed skin to Constantinople as a trophy. The message reached Venice in September. It reached Rome, Madrid, Vienna. Every Christian court heard what had happened to the man who surrendered honourably. And something shifted. For decades, Christian powers had squabbled while the Ottomans expanded. Now they understood. This enemy did not want tribute or territory. This enemy wanted annihilation. Pope Pius V had been trying to forge an alliance for years. Suddenly, his letters found receptive audiences. Spain committed its galleys. Genoa sent ships despite hating Venice. The Knights of Malta, the Duchy of Savoy, even the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. Old rivals putting aside old hatreds because the alternative was waiting for their own Famagustas. They called it the Holy League. On paper, it was the largest Christian naval coalition in centuries. In practice, it was a disaster of egos, competing agendas, and mutual contempt held together by one thing only: terror of what would happen if they failed. The alliance needed a commander, someone all parties could accept, someone who wouldn't favour one faction over another, someone, ideally, with no faction of his own. Someone expendable. They chose a 24-year-old bastard who had never commanded a fleet. The man who would save Christendom was born in a bathhouse to a woman whose name history barely remembers. Barbara Blomberg was a singer. Beautiful, they said. Voice like warm honey. She caught the eye of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, during a visit to Regensburg in 1547. Their affair was brief. The pregnancy was inconvenient. The boy who resulted was a problem that needed solving. They named him Jeremin and hid him with a family of minor nobility. He grew up believing his parents were dead. He played with wooden swords while his half-brother Philip inherited Spain, the Netherlands, Naples, Sicily, and half the New World. Jeremin got a modest education and the persistent sense that he was meant for something more than obscurity. At 11, he learned the truth. Charles, dying and seeking to settle accounts with God, acknowledged his illegitimate son. Young Jeremin became Don John of Austria, still a bastard, still barred from succession, but now a royal bastard with a place at court. Philip II received his new half-brother with the warmth of a man examining a potential rival. The relationship was ice from the start. Philip was cautious, methodical, suspicious by nature and training. Don John was bold, charismatic, hungry. Philip saw a threat, Don John saw a ceiling, a kingdom's worth of talent trapped beneath the glass floor of illegitimate birth. He threw himself into military life. At 23, he commanded the campaign against Moorish rebels in Granada. The war was brutal, mountain fighting, siege warfare, atrocities on both sides. Don John performed well enough to build a reputation, and poorly enough in Philip's eyes to confirm every suspicion. The young commander was too popular, too flashy, too eager for glory. When the Holy League needed a supreme commander, Philip saw an opportunity. Give the bastard the impossible job. If he fails, the failure is his. If he succeeds, Spain gets the credit. Either way, Don John would be far from court, far from influence, commanding a coalition designed to collapse. The appointment letter arrived in July 1571. Don John reportedly read it 3 times before believing it. He was 24 years old. He had never commanded at sea. He was being handed 200 galleys, 80,000 men, and the expectations of Christendom. He was also being handed admirals who wanted him to fail. Gianandrea Doria commanded the Genoese squadron. Aging, cautious, brilliant, and constitutionally incapable of following orders he disagreed with. He had been fighting Ottomans since before Don John was born. Taking commands from a boy who had never seen a naval battle was an insult he swallowed with visible difficulty. Sebastiano Venier commanded the Venetians. 75 years old, white-bearded, built like a wine barrel wrapped in fury. Venice had lost Cyprus. Venice wanted blood. Venier had no patience for politics, protocols, or young Spanish princes who hadn't watched their countrymen skinned alive. Marcantonio Colonna commanded the papal squadron, a Roman nobleman caught between his duty to the Pope and his awareness that Rome needed Spanish favour to survive. He smiled at everyone and trusted no one. These men despised each other. 3 weeks before Lepanto, the coalition nearly collapsed entirely. A Venetian officer accused a Spanish soldier of theft. Words escalated to blades. The Spanish soldier died. Venier, without consulting Don John, without any trial, hanged the Venetian officer responsible and ordered the execution of several Spanish sailors involved in the brawl. Spanish troops rioted. Doria threatened to sail home. Don John found himself mediating between allied commanders who seemed more interested in murdering each other than fighting Turks. Historians still debate whether Don John's handling of this crisis revealed genius or luck. He didn't take sides. He didn't assign blame. He focused every conversation on one thing: the fleet ahead, the enemy waiting, the chance, perhaps the only chance, to strike back for Cyprus. It worked. Barely. The admirals agreed to stop killing each other long enough to face the Ottomans. But Don John understood something that night. His coalition was made of sand. One defeat, one perceived insult, one moment of weakness, and it would dissolve into a dozen private wars. He needed a decisive victory. Not a strategic gain, not a negotiated advantage, a triumph so overwhelming that it would paper over every crack, silence every rival, make even Doria kneel. And he had a weapon none of the admirals fully appreciated. 6 Venetian galleasses, floating fortresses, cargo ships rebuilt into gun platforms carrying 50 cannons each, more firepower than most castles, slow, ugly, impossibly heavy. Every experienced naval commander dismissed them as impractical novelties. Don John looked at those fat, ungainly ships and saw something different. He saw the largest trap in naval history. The Galleass was a mistake that became a miracle. Venice had been building them for decades, oversized merchant galleys modified for warfare, too heavy to maneuver properly, too slow to chase anything. Naval traditionalists mocked them. Real warfare happened on sleek galleys with bronze rams and boarding parties. These floating barns were cargo haulers dressed up as warships. But Francesco Duodo, the Venetian captain assigned to the Galleass squadron, understood something the traditionalists missed. Speed doesn't matter if your enemy comes to you. A galley was a knife, fast, precise, deadly in close quarters. A galleass was a wall of cannons. Put that wall in front of an enemy charge, and speed becomes irrelevant. The enemy must either sail around you, losing formation, losing time, or sail through you. No one had ever tried sailing through 50 cannons firing simultaneously. The 6 galleasses were towed into position before dawn on October 7th. They formed a scattered line about half a mile ahead of the main Christian fleet. From a distance, in the grey pre-dawn light, they looked exactly like what Ottoman spies had reported. Slow merchant vessels, probably supply ships. Certainly not a threat. This was the key to everything. Don John's battle plan was insane by conventional standards. He was outnumbered. Roughly 230 Ottoman galleys against 206 Christian vessels. He was fighting in unfamiliar waters. His coalition was held together with hope and threats. Any sane commander would have sought advantage through maneuver, position, the slow chess game of naval warfare. Instead, Don John planned to charge directly at the enemy centre. Head on, bow to bow, turn the battle into a land fight conducted on wooden decks. But first, the Ottoman fleet had to get through the Galleasses. The night before battle, Don John assembled his captains. The meeting was tense. Venier still furious over the hangings controversy. Doria still sceptical of the entire enterprise. Colonna still calculating which way to jump if things went wrong. Don John spoke simply. Tomorrow they would fight. The Galleasses would break the enemy formation. Then the galleys would close and destroy what remained. No retreat, no negotiation, victory or death. Someone, accounts differ on who, asked what would happen if the Galleasses failed. Don John reportedly smiled. Then we die closer to heaven. It was theatrical, it was manipulative, it worked, but that night, alone in his cabin, Don John must have felt the weight of his gamble. Everything depended on the Ottomans doing exactly what he expected. If they recognized the Galleasses for what they were, if they slowed, probed, sent scouts, the trap would fail. If they approached cautiously, the Christian numerical disadvantage would become decisive. Historians still debate whether Don John was brilliant or lucky. The truth is probably both. He understood his enemy. Ottoman naval doctrine emphasized speed and aggression. Their galleys were designed for ramming and boarding. Their commanders were rewarded for boldness, not caution. Show them slow, fat targets ahead of a weaker fleet and they would charge. They had to charge. 3 miles across the water in his flagship, Ali Pasha was receiving his final briefings. His scouts reported the Christian formation. The Galleasses were noted. Large vessels, probably merchant, was the assessment. The main fleet appeared smaller than Ottoman intelligence had suggested. Perhaps the Christians were having supply problems. Perhaps some squadrons had deserted. Ali Pasha felt confidence swelling in his chest. He had 250 galleys. He had experienced crews hardened by years of Mediterranean raiding. He had the memory of Cyprus behind him. Proof that Christian resistance crumbled eventually, always. The Sultan had sent him to destroy the Holy League, not fight it, destroy it, end the threat permanently. When his captains recommended caution, the Galleasses were unknown, perhaps they should probe first. Ali Pasha dismissed their concerns. Merchant ships, slow, vulnerable. His galleys would brush past them like wolves passing sleeping cattle. By noon tomorrow, he promised, they would be collecting Christian ears for the Sultan's collection. The order went out. Attack at first light. Full speed. No hesitation. Across the dark water on 6 floating fortresses, gun crews finished their preparations. Powder was measured. Shot was stacked. Slow matches were tested and retested. The Galleass cannons were already loaded. They had been loaded for 3 days. Ali Pasha was not a fool. This is important to understand because history has reduced him to a caricature. The arrogant Ottoman who sailed into a trap. The villain who underestimated his enemy and paid with his life. The real man was far more complex, far more capable, and his failure was not stupidity but the logical result of everything he knew. He was 45 years old on the morning of Lepanto. Born to a minor noble family in Ottoman Greece, he had risen through talent rather than birth. Unlike many naval commanders who bought their positions, Ali Pasha had earned his. He had commanded squadrons in a dozen engagements. He had captured Christian vessels, raided Christian ports, understood Christian tactics as well as any man alive. The Sultan trusted him completely. That trust was not given lightly. When Ali Pasha received command of the Lepanto fleet, he understood his mission precisely: find the Christian coalition and destroy it before it could threaten Ottoman control of the eastern Mediterranean. Cyprus was secure, the next target would be Crete, then perhaps Sicily. But first, the Holy League had to be eliminated. His intelligence network was excellent. Spies in Venice, informants in Rome, merchants who sold information along with silk. He knew about Don John's appointment, knew the young bastard had no naval experience. He knew about the tensions between Spanish and Venetian commanders. He knew the coalition was fragile, held together by fear rather than trust. What he didn't know, couldn't know, was what the Venetians had done to 6 merchant ships. The Galleass program was a closely guarded secret. Venice understood that surprise was their only advantage. The few Ottoman spies who caught glimpses of the vessels reported exactly what they appeared to be: oversized cargo haulers, probably supply ships for the fleet, certainly not combat vessels. Ali Pasha received these reports and filed them appropriately, under irrelevant. The night before battle, he called his captains to a final council. The Christian fleet had been spotted anchoring near the entrance to the Gulf of Patras. They would have to come out eventually. When they did, the Ottoman fleet would be waiting. One captain, Uluj Ali, the converted Christian who commanded the Ottoman left wing, raised a concern. Those large ships ahead of the Christian formation. Shouldn't they investigate before committing to battle? Ali Pasha reportedly laughed. Merchant vessels, he said. Fat, slow, probably carrying supplies. Our galleys will pass them like fish swimming past rocks. The phrase would haunt Ottoman memory for generations. Historians still debate whether Ali Pasha could have done anything differently. His decision made sense with the information he had. Ottoman galleys were faster than anything Christians could field. Large vessels meant slow vessels. Slow vessels were obstacles, not threats. He had no frame of reference for what a galleass could do because nothing like it had ever been used in battle before. This was the genius of Don John's plan and the tragedy of Ali Pasha's death. The trap worked precisely because it shouldn't have worked. No reasonable commander would have expected cargo ships to be gun platforms. No reasonable analysis would have flagged them as dangerous. Ali Pasha was reasonable, and reason killed him. That night he wrote a letter to his wife in Constantinople. The contents were never recorded, but messengers noted he seemed calm, confident, perhaps even cheerful. He went to bed early. He would need his strength tomorrow. Across the water, Don John was also awake, but not sleeping. He walked the deck of his flagship, the Real, watching the distant Ottoman campfires flicker on the water, counting them, calculating. His secretary Garcia de Toledo found him there near midnight. "You should rest, Highness." Don John didn't turn. "How many fires do you count?" Garcia looked across the dark water. "Many. More than us." Don John's voice was flat. "They have more ships, more men, more experience. Their admiral has won battles. I have won arguments with my brother's courtiers." Garcia said nothing. There was nothing to say. "Tomorrow," Don John continued, "either those galleasses work or we all meet God." He finally turned, and his secretary saw something strange in the young commander's eyes. Not fear, not confidence, something like hunger. "Make sure the gun crews are awake before first light. I want those cannons hot when the sun rises." Don John went to his cabin. He didn't sleep, neither did 30,000 men who would not see tomorrow's sunset. The sun set on October 6th, and 200,000 men prepared to die. They didn't know, most of them, that this would be the largest naval battle in 1,000 years. They didn't know historians would study this day for centuries. They knew only their own small terrors, the blister on a sword hand, the smell of pitch and fear, the weight of armour that would drag them down if they fell into the water. Don John ordered confession available for every man who wanted it. Priests moved through the fleet like ghosts in black robes, hearing sins, granting absolutions, promising paradise to men who would be corpses by nightfall. The lines stretched for hours. What does a man confess before battle? Some admitted murders, thefts, betrayals, the usual currency of soldiers' guilt. Some confessed love for women, not their wives. Some confessed doubt, which was perhaps the most dangerous sin of all. One young Spanish soldier, his name lost to history, reportedly told his priest that he was afraid he would run. When the boarding started, When the killing got close, he feared his legs would carry him away from the fight. The priest asked what frightened him most. "Not dying," the soldier said. "Everyone dies. I'm afraid of dying a coward, of my name being a curse to my family." The priest gave him absolution and a piece of advice. "Stay close to the man beside you. Fear is harder when you're not alone." The soldier thanked him. History doesn't record whether the advice helped. History doesn't record whether he survived. On the Ottoman side, imams led evening prayers. The rhythms were different, the words were different, but the fear was the same. Men bowed toward Mecca and asked God for strength, for courage, for the quick death that wouldn't leave them screaming in the water with their guts floating beside them. Historians still debate whether the soldiers on either side truly hated each other. The commanders spoke of holy war, of existential struggle, of civilizations in conflict. But the men who would actually die, many of them had more in common with the enemy across the water than with the admirals who commanded them. Poverty, conscription, a system that used them and discarded them. They killed each other anyway, that's what systems do. Don John spent the evening hours finalizing his battle order. The Christian fleet would form 3 main divisions. He would command the center, 62 galleys anchored by his flagship. On his left, the Venetians under Venier. On his right, the Genoese under Doria, and ahead of them all the 6 galleasses. The positioning was precise. Each galleass would sit roughly half a mile ahead of the main line, creating a scattered barrier the Ottomans would have to pass. The gaps between them were intentional, wide enough that Ottoman galleys could attempt to slip through, narrow enough that those galleys would be under fire from multiple angles as they passed. It was not a formation any naval textbook recommended. Don John was gambling that the textbooks were wrong. His last order of the night was the most controversial. Traditional Mediterranean galleys carried a long iron ram at the bow, a weapon for punching holes in enemy hulls. Ramming was how naval battles were supposed to work. You hit the enemy below the waterline, you flooded their ship, you won. Don John ordered the rams removed. His captains thought he had lost his mind. Doria reportedly sent a message asking if the order was a mistake. It was not. Without rams, Don John explained, the Christian galleys would ride higher in the water. Their bowguns, normally aimed at an angle because of the ram, could fire straight ahead. More importantly, removing the ram removed the temptation to fight the Ottoman way. "We're not going to sink them," Don John told his commanders. "We're going to board them. We're going to take their ships and kill their crews. This is not a naval battle. This is a land battle on water." It was insane. It was brilliant. It worked. But that night, watching the stars turn overhead, Don John allowed himself one moment of doubt. He was 24 years old. He had never fought at sea. Tomorrow, he would either validate every gamble he had ever made or confirm every suspicion his brother Philip harboured. He thought about Barbara Blomberg, his mother, the woman he had never really known, who had given him life and then given him away. He wondered if she would hear about this battle, if she would care. Then he put the thought aside. Sentimentality was for survivors. He would know which category he belonged to soon enough. Dawn came blood-red over the Gulf of Patras. The first Ottoman galleys emerged from the morning haze like wolves scenting prey. Their drums began the attack rhythm, a deep, pounding heartbeat that carried across the water. 200 vessels moving in unison, oars rising and falling, bronze rams catching the early light. From the Christian fleet, the sight was terrifying. The Ottoman formation stretched nearly 4 miles across the horizon. In the centre, Ali Pasha's flagship flew an enormous green banner, embroidered with the name of Allah, 29,000 times, according to legend, written in gold thread. The banner had never been captured in battle. Never. Don John stood on the raised fighting platform of the reel, watching the enemy approach. He wore no armour, not yet. He wanted his men to see him, to see that he was calm, that their commander had not yet put on the weight of battle. The distance closed, 3 miles, 2 miles, 1. The Ottoman galleys passed the outer marker where Venetian scouts had anchored the night before. They were committed now, moving at attack speed, too fast to stop if something went wrong. Don John raised his hand. Across the Christian fleet, trumpets sounded. Men who had been waiting in silence, some since midnight, stirred to final preparations. Swords drawn, arquebuses loaded, prayers completed. The galleasses sat silent in the water ahead, their bulk dark against the brightening sky. Ali Pasha, watching from his flagship, barely noticed them. His attention was fixed on Don John's banner. The young bastard had raised his personal standard, blue and white, visible for miles, a challenge, an insult. Ali Pasha raised his own standard in response. He was going directly for the Christian commander. Cut off the head, and the body dies. His galleys accelerated. The first Ottoman vessels reached the Galleass line at approximately 7:30 in the morning. What happened next would be remembered for centuries. The Galleass captains had been given simple orders. Wait until you can see their faces, then fire everything. They waited. The Ottoman galleys came on, oars churning, drums pounding. Some captains noticed the gun ports on the cargo ships ahead. A few shouted warnings. It was far too late. At 200 yards, the Galleasses opened fire. 50 cannons per ship, 6 ships, 300 cannons firing simultaneously into a packed mass of wooden vessels moving at maximum speed. The sound was unlike anything the Mediterranean had ever heard. Not thunder. Thunder was a single crack. This was a rolling avalanche of noise, continuous, overwhelming. Men later described it as the sky falling. The first Ottoman line simply ceased to exist. Galleys that had been intact moments before became clouds of splinters, bodies, and smoke. Ships directly in front of the gun platforms took multiple hits below the waterline and went down in seconds, their crews spilling into water already churning with debris and blood. The second line fared no better. They were too close to stop, too committed to turn. They crashed into the wreckage of the first line and into the continuing broadside fire. A Venetian officer aboard one galleass later wrote that the water changed colour in front of his ship. It went from blue to red to a brownish froth of blood, seawater, and splintered wood. Bodies floated past faster than he could count them. Historians still debate whether the Galleasses alone could have won the battle. They probably could not. There were only 6 of them, and the Ottoman fleet was vast. But they achieved something more important than destruction. They created chaos. The Ottoman formation, the precise coordinated attack plan that Ali Pasha had drilled for weeks, shattered in the first 15 minutes. Galleys that survived the initial barrage scattered, some trying to sail around the gun platforms, others attempting to retreat, still others pressing forward into the carnage. The disciplined crescent of Ottoman naval power became a confused mass of individual vessels, and into that confusion came the Christian galleys. Don John had given one order for this moment: attack. No coordination, no waiting for signals. The moment the Galleasses fired, every Christian galley was to advance at maximum speed into the disrupted enemy formation. It was controlled chaos, but chaos the Christians had planned for. The Ottoman fleet was supposed to fight in formation. They trained for coordinated maneuvers, mutual support, the geometric precision of naval warfare. Now they were fighting in a confused melee, every ship for itself. The Christians had trained for exactly this kind of brawl. Don John's flagship struck the first enemy galley at full speed. The crash shattered oars on both vessels, sent men tumbling across blood-slicked decks. Spanish soldiers poured over the railings before the ships had even stopped moving. The Battle of Lepanto had begun. The collision between flagships was personal. Don John's Reel and Ali Pasha's Sultana met bow to bow in the centre of the battle, both commanders having sought each other deliberately. This was medieval warfare's logic. Kill the enemy king, and the army crumbles. The impact threw men off their feet on both vessels. Grappling hooks flew, ropes tangled. Within seconds, the two ships were locked together, their fates inseparable. Spanish arquebusiers opened fire first. Their volleys swept the Sultana's deck, cutting down Ottoman sailors before they could organise resistance. But the Janissaries, the Sultan's elite infantry, held their ground. They had trained for this. Close combat was their specialty. The boarding action that followed was not a battle, it was butchery. Men fought in spaces so narrow they couldn't swing swords. They stabbed, they punched, they bit. They gouged eyes and crushed windpipes with their bare hands. The deck became so slick with blood that soldiers crawled rather than risk slipping. Don John fought in the front line. This was either brave or foolish, probably both. He took an arrow wound to the ankle early in the fighting and kept standing. He killed at least one Ottoman officer personally, according to witnesses. Whether this was heroism or recklessness, it electrified his men. The Spanish pushed forward. Step by bloody step, they drove toward the Sultana's stern, where Ali Pasha directed the defence. 3 times the Janissaries counterattacked. 3 times they pushed the Christians back toward the bow. The deck changed hands 4 times in 2 hours. bodies piled so deep that men tripped over the dead to reach the living. A Spanish soldier later wrote that the noise was worse than the killing. Metal on metal, screaming, always screaming, the wet, heavy sound of blades finding flesh, and beneath it all, the groaning of the ships themselves, their timbers protesting the violence being done aboard them. Historians still debate whether Ali Pasha could have escaped. His left wing, under Ulu Jali, was winning its engagement. If Ali Pasha had withdrawn, regrouped, he might have salvaged something from the disaster. But withdrawal was not in his nature. He had promised the Sultan a victory. He would deliver it, or die trying. The end came around noon. A Spanish soldier, his name preserved as either Miguel de Cervantes or possibly a soldier near him, accounts differ, fought his way close to the Ottoman commander's position. Ali Pasha was wounded by this point, still fighting, still directing his remaining men. What happened next is disputed. Some accounts say he was shot through the head by an arquebus, others say he was cut down by a soldier's sword while attempting to surrender. The most dramatic version, probably apocryphal, claims he was still giving orders when a Spanish pike took him through the chest. However it happened, Ali Pasha died on his own deck. A Spanish soldier hacked off his head. Don John received the trophy minutes later. The head of the Ottoman Supreme Commander, still dripping, presented on a pike by a soldier expecting reward. Don John looked at it for a long moment. "Throw it in the sea," he reportedly said. "We're better than this." This may have happened. Don John had a theatrical sense of honour, or it may be propaganda, the Christian prince too noble to desecrate an enemy's remains. Either way, the legend served its purpose. What is certain is what happened next. Don John ordered Ali Pasha's banner, the green standard with Allah's name written 29,000 times, struck from the Sultana's mast. In its place, the Christians raised the cross. The battle was not over. Fighting continued for hours on both flanks. But when the Ottoman centre saw their admiral's banner fall, something broke. It broke in the hearts of men who had been told they were invincible, who had been promised divine favour, who had watched Cyprus fall and believed nothing could stop them. The centre crumbled. Ottoman galleys began to flee. Some threw their wounded overboard to gain speed. Some ran aground on the nearby coast. Some simply stopped fighting, their crews too shattered to continue. Don John stood on the captured deck of the Sultana, bleeding from his ankle wound, surrounded by the dead, and watched the Ottoman formation dissolve. He had done it. The bastard son had broken the greatest navy in the world. But as he would learn, victory was only the beginning of his problems. Ulu Jali was winning. This mattered more than anything else happening on the water, though Don John didn't know it yet. While the centre collapsed and the Ottoman right disintegrated, the Ottoman left wing under Ulu Jali was destroying the Christian right. Ulu Jali was born Giovanni Dionigi Galeni in Calabria, southern Italy. Captured by Ottoman raiders as a young man, he converted to Islam rather than die a slave. By 1571, he had risen to become one of the most feared corsair admirals in the Mediterranean, a renegade Christian who commanded Muslim warriors, who raided his own former countrymen, who had made himself indispensable to the Sultan. He understood Christian tactics because he had once fought for Christians. He knew their weaknesses, their vanities, their patterns, and he saw what Doria was doing. The Genoese commander had been ordered to hold the Christian right wing, to match the Ottoman left and prevent encirclement. Instead, Doria was edging southward, away from the main battle, stretching a gap between his squadron and Don John's centre. Historians still debate whether Doria was cautious, cowardly, or following secret instructions from Genoa to preserve his ships regardless of the battle's outcome. Whatever his reasons, his movement created an opportunity. Ulu Jali took it. He drove his galleys through the gap Doria had opened, swinging behind the Christian right wing. Suddenly, Christian ships that had been facing forward found enemies at their backs. The Knights of Malta, holding the extreme right, were surrounded. The Maltese fought like cornered lions. The knights were warrior monks who had dedicated their lives to killing Muslims. Surrender was not in their vocabulary. Their flagship held out for hours, its deck heaped with dead, its captain wounded 7 times before finally falling. Ulu Jali personally captured the flagship standard, the knight's banner sacred to the order, and prepared to withdraw with his prize. This was the moment the battle could have turned. If Ulu Jali had pressed his advantage, if he had swept into the Christian rear, caused a general panic, the victory at the centre might have been meaningless. Don John's fleet could have been encircled and destroyed despite Ali Pasha's death. But Ulu Jali looked at the centre. He saw the green banner falling. He saw Ottoman galleys fleeing, he saw the scale of the disaster unfolding, and he made a calculation. The battle was lost, not his part of it. His squadron was winning, but the fleet, the Sultan's fleet, the instrument that had taken Cyprus and threatened all of Christendom, was being destroyed. Every ship Ulugh Ali lost pursuing glory here was a ship the Sultan would not have for the rebuilding. He ordered a retreat. His squadron disengaged with professional precision. They took their prizes, including the knight's banner, and sailed for open water. Behind them, the Christian right wing was too battered to pursue. Don John, seeing the Maltese standard disappear over the horizon, reportedly screamed in frustration. The knight's banner was a sacred relic. Its loss was a stain on Christian honour, but Ulugh Ali had saved something more important than a banner. He had saved nearly 90 Ottoman galleys, the nucleus of a fleet that could be rebuilt. He had preserved the trained crews, the experienced officers, the institutional knowledge that would allow the Ottomans to return to the sea. Within a year, the Sultan would have a new fleet, larger than the one lost at Lepanto, built with the knowledge of what had gone wrong. Ulugh Ali would command it. This was the bitter irony of the victory. Don John won the battle, decisively, overwhelmingly, historically, but Ulugh Ali won the war. The Christian coalition would collapse within 2 years. The Holy League would never fight together again. Cyprus would remain Ottoman for 3 more centuries. Ulugh Ali retired rich and honoured, dying in his bed in Constantinople in 1587. He never lost another major battle. Don John would be dead in 7 years, discarded by the brother who had sent him to glory. But that afternoon none of this was visible. Only the water, red with blood. Only the floating wreckage. Only the cries of the drowning. The Battle of Lepanto was over. The dying was just beginning. Victory smelled like rot. Within 2 days, the Gulf of Patras had become a charnel house. Bodies floated in rafts caught against wreckage, wedged in the shallows. The October sun was still warm enough to begin the process of decay. The stench reached the Christian fleet before the visual horror did. Don John ordered the fleet to anchor upwind. The work of cataloguing victory began. Clerks moved from ship to ship, counting captured vessels, recording freed slaves, tallying the dead. The numbers were staggering. Over 170 Ottoman galleys captured or destroyed, 12,000 Christian slaves liberated, many of them kissing the decks of ships that had killed their captors, weeping, unable to believe they would not die at the oar. Christian losses: 17 galleys sunk, 8,000 dead or wounded. Ottoman losses: 30,000 dead. The cream of the Sultan's naval power, destroyed in an afternoon. It was the most one-sided naval victory in a millennium. Don John received congratulations from every captain who could reach his flagship. Men who had doubted him, despised him, wanted him to fail, they knelt before him now. The bastard son had become the saviour of Christendom. For approximately 2 weeks, Don John was the most celebrated man in Europe. Then the letters started arriving. The first came from Philip II. His brother's tone was carefully calibrated, congratulatory but cool. Yes, a great victory. Yes, honour to Spain. But there would be no immediate follow-up campaign. The treasury was strained. The fleet needed repairs. Translation: Don John would not be permitted to build on his triumph. The second wave of letters came from Venice. The Republic was delighted by the victory. Their honour had been avenged, their slaves freed. But they were already negotiating secretly with Constantinople. The Venetians understood what Don John did not yet grasp. The victory changed nothing strategically. Cyprus was still lost. Ottoman shipyards were already working around the clock. Within a year, the Sultan would have more galleys than before. Venice needed peace, not crusade, and the hero of Lepanto was an obstacle to peace. Historians still debate whether Don John could have salvaged his moment. If he had been more politically astute, more willing to compromise, more able to see himself as others saw him, a useful tool becoming a dangerous threat, perhaps he might have navigated the aftermath. But Don John was not politically astute. He was 24 years old and had just won the greatest naval battle in living memory. He expected the world to reward him accordingly. The world had other plans. Philip summoned him home in November. The journey was triumphal. Crowds cheered him in Messina, in Naples, in every port. The Pope sent blessings. Artists began painting the battle before the blood had dried. Don John accepted the adulation as his due. He began speaking openly of his ambitions, a kingdom of his own. Perhaps Albania, freed from Ottoman rule. Perhaps England, where Catholic conspirators whispered that the rightful monarch could be restored. These whispers reached Philip's ears. The King of Spain heard them and began to worry. His bastard brother had become too famous, too ambitious, too dangerous. The process of containment began quietly. Don John was given commands, but commands that led nowhere. He was sent to pacify the Netherlands, a quagmire that had swallowed Spanish reputations for decades. He was given resources, but never quite enough resources. The man who had united Christendom's fleet was being carefully, bureaucratically, slowly destroyed. He didn't realise it at first. He was Don John of Austria. He had killed the Ottoman admiral with his own hands. God was on his side. God, it turned out, had limited influence at the Spanish court. Within 3 years of Lepanto, Don John understood that he would never receive a kingdom, never lead another great crusade, never be anything more than a useful weapon kept sharp but safely sheathed. The victory had made him too valuable to promote and too famous to ignore. It had made him a problem. In Constantinople, Selim II received news of the disaster with something less than devastation. His admirals were dead or disgraced. His fleet was destroyed. Christian Europe was celebrating. He reportedly said, "You have only singed my beard. It will grow back thicker." Then he ordered every shipyard in the empire to begin construction immediately. By March 1572, 5 months after Lepanto, the Ottoman navy had 200 new galleys. Some were poorly built, rushed to completion with green timber that would rot within years. But they were galleys. They floated. They carried men. The Sultan's beard was growing back. The Holy League, meanwhile, was dissolving. Spain and Venice blamed each other for insufficient commitment. Genoa demanded compensation for ships lost. The Pope died in May 1572, and his successor had different priorities. Don John sailed with a coalition fleet in summer 1572. They accomplished nothing. The Ottomans refused battle, and the Christians couldn't agree on objectives. By autumn, the alliance was effectively dead. Lepanto had changed nothing, except perhaps for one thing. It had proven that the Ottomans could be beaten. The myth of invincibility was broken, and that mattered. Not strategically, not immediately, but in the minds of men who had been taught to despair. Don John had given Europe its pride back. He would learn how little gratitude that earned. By 1576, Don John of Austria was the most frustrating man in Europe. Philip II received weekly reports from informants at his brother's court. Don John was corresponding with the Pope about a possible invasion of England. Don John was in contact with Mary, Queen of Scots, the Catholic claimant to the English throne. Don John was dreaming publicly about the kingdom he deserved. The Spanish king read these reports and felt his stomach tighten. He had created a monster, not a disloyal one. Don John showed no signs of plotting against Spain itself, but a monster of ambition, of fame, of unrealistic expectation. Don John had been useful at Lepanto, now he was becoming dangerous. Philip's solution was elegant in its cruelty. He sent Don John to the Netherlands. The Spanish Netherlands were a nightmare. Protestant rebellion, foreign intervention, terrain that swallowed armies, a population that hated their Catholic masters. No commander had succeeded there. The region was a graveyard of reputations. Philip positioned it as an honour. His brother would be Governor-General, the king's personal representative. In reality, it was exile. Don John accepted because he had no choice. He was still a bastard, still dependent on Philip's favour. And perhaps, he told himself, the Netherlands could be a stepping stone. Pacify the rebels, prove his worth again, and the kingdom might follow. He arrived in Luxembourg in November 1576. He was 30 years old. The situation was worse than anyone had warned him. Spanish troops had mutinied over unpaid wages and sacked Antwerp. The Spanish fury that killed 8,000 civilians and united every faction in the Netherlands against Spain. Don John was inheriting not a rebellion but a catastrophe. He tried negotiation. The pacification of Ghent had created a fragile peace, and Don John extended offers of reconciliation. For a few months, there was hope. Then Philip's instructions arrived: crush the heretics. No compromise. Historians still debate whether Don John could have achieved a different outcome. The war was perhaps unwinnable. The Dutch too determined, the terrain too favourable to defence, Spanish resources too stretched across a global empire. But Don John's failure was spectacular regardless. His campaigns achieved little. His health began failing, fevers, exhaustion, mysterious ailments that doctors couldn't diagnose. His correspondence grew increasingly desperate. He begged Philip for reinforcements that never came. He pleaded for money that arrived months late. He wrote to Rome, to allies, to anyone who might help. Philip read the letters and did nothing. The King of Spain had decided his brother was more useful as a cautionary tale than as a success. Don John's floundering in the Netherlands proved that Lepanto had been luck, not genius. It justified keeping him far from Spain, far from influence. Don John understood this. In his last letters, the tone shifts from desperation to something like resignation. He wrote about honour, about duty, about serving God regardless of earthly reward. The confidence of the young commander at Lepanto had been replaced by the weariness of a man who knew he was being sacrificed. The body began failing faster than the spirit. By summer 1578, Don John could barely ride. Fevers racked him for days at a time. His doctors suspected typhus, camp fever they called it, though some whispered about poison. Philip was certainly capable of it. He had poisoned inconvenient people before, but there's no evidence, and typhus was common enough in military camps. The truth was simpler and sadder. Don John was dying of neglect, sent to an impossible task, denied resources, abandoned by the brother he had served faithfully. The stress and the strain and the bitter disappointment were eating him alive. On October 1st, 1578, almost exactly 7 years after his greatest triumph, Don John of Austria took to his bed in a camp near Namur. He did not get up. The body was brought back to Spain. Philip II ordered it done properly, a royal funeral, appropriate honours, the trappings of respect he had denied his brother in life. The corpse was embalmed, dressed in armour, placed in a lead coffin that would preserve it for the long journey south. Don John had wanted to be buried at the Escorial, the vast palace monastery Philip was building outside Madrid. He wanted to rest among kings, acknowledged at last as part of the family that had always held him at arm's length. Philip granted the request. It was the cheapest tribute he could offer. Don John was dead. Dead men don't scheme for kingdoms. Dead heroes become useful symbols, their inconvenient ambitions safely buried with their bones. The funeral was magnificent. Cardinals presided. Nobles processed. The story told from pulpits across Europe celebrated the saviour of Christendom, the young prince who had humbled the Turk, the perfect knight of Catholic legend. The story forgot everything that mattered. It forgot the coalition that fell apart within 2 years, forgot Venice signing a separate peace with Constantinople, while Christian corpses still floated in the Gulf of Patras, forgot the Ottoman fleet rebuilt in months, larger than before, under the command of Ulujalli, the renegade who had escaped Lepanto and now directed the Sultan's revenge. It forgot Cyprus, which remained Ottoman for 300 more years. It forgot the 30,000 dead, Christian and Muslim both, whose names no one recorded, whose families never learned how they died, whose bodies fed the fish of the Ionian Sea. Historians still debate whether Lepanto mattered. The battle was real, the victory was genuine. But what did it achieve? It did not stop Ottoman expansion. The Sultan's armies would still threaten Vienna a century later. It did not restore Christian unity. Within decades, Europe would tear itself apart in the 30 Years' War. It did not even protect Mediterranean shipping. Piracy flourished for centuries after. What it did was create a legend. And legends are strange things. They outlive the men they celebrate. They outlive the causes they served. They take on meanings their creators never intended. Don John of Austria became a symbol of Christian triumph over Islam. His portrait hung in churches. His name was invoked in crusades that never happened, in wars he would not have recognized. Poets praised him. Painters glorified him. G.K. Chesterton, 3.5 centuries later, would write that Don John has set his people free. But his people were never free. The slaves he liberated went home to poverty. The soldiers he commanded went home to obscurity. The coalition he led went home to squabble over the scraps of victory. The empire endured. The Holy Roman Empire, the Spanish Empire, the structure of Catholic Europe, it all continued grinding forward, using and discarding men like Don John as it always had. The man did not endure. He died in a tent of a fever at 31, betrayed not by enemies but by the system he served, used when useful, abandoned when inconvenient. His body lies in the Escorial now, in the pantheon of the Infante, not the pantheon of kings. Even in death, the bastard son is kept apart from legitimate royalty. Even in death, the hierarchy holds. The victory at Lepanto is remembered, the price is forgotten. The banner fell, the fleet burned, the water turned red, and then the world moved on, as it always does. 30,000 men died in the Gulf of Patras. One man is remembered. None of them chose their fates. History remembers the triumph. It forgets the cost. They built statues. They didn't build graves.